In this set of videos, we're going to cover chapters 5 and 6 of Held's Ethics of Care. Those two are called Liberalism and the Ethics of Care. And then 6, that's 5. 6 is called Caring Relations and Principles of Justice. Held outlines in the beginning of chapter 5 critiques of liberal individualism from the perspective of the ethics of care. And she has in mind, in particular, Kant and Mill, but also John Rawls, who's is more of a 20th century philosopher. Liberal individualism, she says, tends to look at human beings as independent, as if everyone is an adult head of household. And it ignores the experience of dependence, interdependence, and interconnectedness. She also, number 2, thinks that liberal individualism promotes only calculated self-interest. It asks us always to be self-interested, even when we're engaged in enlightened self-interest, as, for instance, when someone engages in so-called self-sacrifice in the utilitarianism picture, but they're really just choosing a higher pleasure for themselves. The third is that it buys into the illusion that we're free to form whatever relationships we choose. Many of our relationships are chosen for us by the family we're born into, the society we're born into, where we live. So think of the differences in the quality of public schools. If you know LA County a little bit, the difference in quality in public schools between Inglewood and Santa Monica. There are huge differences in quality because of the differences in tax base. Now, the kids who grow up in Inglewood don't choose to be born and grow up there. The kids who grow in Santa Monica don't choose to be born and grow up there. So again, 3, liberal individualism buys into the illusion that we're free to form whatever relationships we want, and it ignores the relationships we are encumbered with. So relationships we're encumbered with are any relationships that don't come about as a result of our own free choice, but due to the circumstances of our lives, we are thrust into those relationships. And even if we want to disentangle ourselves from them, like a relationship with a bad parent, that can prove to be very, very difficult. Fourth, in the process of emphasizing universal principles, as Kant and Mill do, liberal individualism, Held thinks, ignores the human bonds of families, friends, groups, and nations. Those bonds give us obligations beyond not just using others merely as a means to an end. Parents don't just treat children with respect. The parent-child relationship requires much more than that. So it's the same with nations. So historically, the United States has a special relationship with France, and it's historically based on their help with the American Revolution. And of course, the Statue of Liberty was a gift from the people of France. And fifth, Held believes that liberal individualism ignores what she calls the prerequisites for autonomy, those material, psychological, and social prerequisites that we have to be in place in order to exercise and even to own our autonomy fully. When Held is outlining her theory of the prerequisites of autonomy, she doesn't say enough about it, I think, but what she does say is fascinating. Held agrees with Kant's emphasis on autonomy, but she doesn't think that we all possess unlimited autonomy simply by virtue of the fact that we're rational beings. So Held wants to make the point that for many of us, certain prerequisites of autonomy are not yet met. missing those prerequisites, not having these things that I'm going to list out on the next 3 slides, actually limits our autonomy. And so she talks about the prerequisites of autonomy as material, psychological, or social. So what would be a material prerequisite of autonomy? Well, money would be a material prerequisite of autonomy, because without money, our options are much more limited than they would be if sufficient money were available to us. Likewise, housing. If we're unsheltered or if we're food insecure, then the search for shelter and protection or our next meal is going to consume our time and energy. Access to healthcare is a material prerequisite of autonomy because health is a physical condition. If we're ill, that makes us much less able to make choices, including the choice to help others. Time is also an important prerequisite of autonomy. So I think of many of the people who work at LMU in positions like housekeeping or gardening or food service. When I see one of them in the elevator towards, let's say, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is a common time for them to leave, I'll ask them whether they're going home or they're going to a second job. And many of them are working 2 or 3 jobs in order to be able to feed and house their families and get medical care for their families. They obviously don't have time for the kind of parenting that many of us experienced. Our parents helped our children get our homework done. In some cases, of course, parents are underemployed. They want to get more education in order to qualify themselves for a better job. If you're working all the time and you don't have time to go back to school, you can't retrain in that way. And another material prerequisite of autonomy is basic safety. So if we're without adequate police protection, many of our choices are constrained or limited. And of course, the worst case scenario, which unfortunately we've seen many times in certain communities, is that the police themselves become dangerous to the citizens. And in those cases, one of the most basic prerequisites of autonomy, a feeling of basic safety and protection, is not there. And the choices that the person is able to make are correspondingly limited. Now, by the way, these 3 slides, the 3 lists of the prerequisites of autonomy, are not exhaustive. I'm sure you can add with your own brainstorming greatly to these 3 lists. So these are examples of prerequisites of autonomy. This is not a full list of those. If we look then at the psychological prerequisites of autonomy, self-confidence is required in order for us to believe that we're capable of choosing. A lack of self-confidence puts a person in a very passive position where he or she is not likely to make even those choices that their circumstances allow them to make. Likewise, if you are mentally ill, that mental illness will greatly limit your choices. If you don't have access to adequate mental health care, that lack of mental health, that mental health condition will limit your autonomy. Likewise, certain beliefs that we might have are psychological prerequisites of autonomy or demonstrate the absence of a psychological prerequisite of autonomy. And so, for instance, if I believe that the system is stacked against me, that's going to discourage me from exercising my autonomy because I'm holding this belief that I won't get ahead regardless of my level of effort. So I'm not going to put the effort in. And if I don't put in the effort, I'm not going to exercise my autonomy. And finally, here, resilience is a prerequisite of autonomy. And what I mean by resilience is the ability to recover from setbacks. And none of us is really born resilient. Resilience is learned and empowered by those around us. And so For instance, the parent who works 2 or 3 jobs won't be available to teach a child resilience. And likewise, a parent who is beaten down by difficult circumstances in life, whether those are illness, economic concerns, something like that, are not going to be available to build resilience. And that leads actually directly into this list of the social prerequisites of autonomy. That one huge prerequisite of autonomy is mentoring. That you have mentors in your life who are experienced in areas that matter to you, wise elders who are able to advise you in life. If you're missing that, it's going to be a limit on your autonomy. You will be less autonomous. You'll have less options available to you. And one of the reasons you'll have less options available to you is you won't know what options are there without mentors who've been there before, who say, oh, you're having this problem with this professor, go to the department chair. Well, if you're the first in your family in college, you may not know what a department chair is or that you have any right to go to them with a concern. And so this is one of the reasons why LMU and many other schools have programs like First to Go, where those who are the first in their families to go to college can receive mentoring from staff members of LMU and faculty members of LMU who themselves were the first in their families to go to college, about how college actually works, because that increases your options when you know what the options are. If you have an option and you're not aware of the option, it's as good as not having the option in the first place. And by the way, some years I volunteer to mentor in that program. Likewise, social connections, a social network is necessary for the exercise of many choices. So I just put here in parentheses, you need connections in order to get into a good kindergarten or private school these days. We also, as a social prerequisite of autonomy, need people who will take care of our needs at times that we can't. So of course, the infant or the small child is the most trenchant example of this, but also while you're seeking an education, for instance, you're going to find it very difficult to be employed full time. So you need your parents or someone else in your family, someone who cares about you, to pay for your, even if not your tuition, to help you cover your clothing, to help you cover your food, your dental care, things like that. We also need peers whom we have something in common with. And so I put something in parentheses here about an only. What I mean by an only is if LMU hires, let's say that we have, I don't know, a studio arts program that has no people of color in it, no faculty of color in it. Obviously, we're going to have students, but there was a time when we did. It's not now, it's pretty diverse right now, but let's say that you have a department like that and you hire a faculty member of color into that department. For the years that that's the only person of color who is teaching in the department, that person has no peers, and not having those peers misses one of the prerequisites of autonomy unless that person is very resourceful at finding their own peers outside their department. It's going to be much more difficult for them to develop their professional career and to navigate the different things, the different difficulties that come up. We also need partners for projects that require more than one person to accomplish. So many of the choices we might take might require us to recruit other people to help us with that project. If those partners are missing, if we can't get partners for our projects, we won't effectively be able to choose those things. We'll have fewer options available to us, and we'll therefore have less autonomy. And finally, final example from me, again, you can brainstorm a lot more. We need friends in order to relieve stress, right? If you're stressed out, one of the things that happens is you get tunnel vision. You can only see what's right in front of you. which means it becomes very difficult to imagine and come up with other options than, let's say, the black and white options that we have right in front of us. So we need friends who will help us relieve stress. Also, when we have setbacks, we need friends to help us recover from those setbacks and just to encourage us in all kinds of ways. So one of the ways that the ethics of care, like Mill's utilitarianism, is a program of social reform is Held thinks if we're really committed to autonomy, as Kant is, we have to talk much more about these three different categories of material, psychological, and social prerequisites of autonomy, and how, as a society, we can see to it that those prerequisites are met for as many people in the society as possible, because that's how many autonomous people we're going to have. I just want to clarify one possible misunderstanding. When Held says prerequisite of autonomy, she doesn't mean that someone who doesn't have every single one of these things is not going to be autonomous. Instead, what she means is the lack of any one of these prerequisites is going to limit our autonomy because it's going to give us fewer choices. And that's the point that she thinks Kant has missed in essentially implying that as soon as we're rational, as soon as we come online as conscious rational beings, we possess autonomy fully. And Held wants to say, no, a lot of other things have to be in place in order for us to enjoy and exercise our full autonomy.